family. This is Arkeet Hodges here, president of the Black Achievement Fund and president of Education for Life Academy, here with class 8 of our Missing Pages of World History lecture series in honor of Dr. John Henrik Clarke. I do this lecture series, for those of you who just tuning in, once a year. And I do it because this is one of the most important aspects of the Black Achievement Fund movement, and that is liberation from mental enslavement, liberation from the propaganda of racism and of white supremacy. I do this lecture series because even though I graduated from the University of Virginia and Cornell with degrees in African-American studies and history and Africana studies, these missing pages of world history that I've been teaching you guys, none of this was taught in college or graduate school. Absolutely none of it. The Academy has tried fiercely to deny the Africanity of ancient Egypt, of ancient Nubia, so that they can affirm the theory of racism, of white superiority. There is absolutely no way under the sun you can teach history from where history begins in Africa over 200,000 years ago, go in chronological order, and come up with the conclusion that European people are superior to everyone else. In fact, when you do that study, it becomes absolutely laughable, absolutely laughable. Now, this lecture series, again, is in honor of Dr. John Henrik Clarke. He is one of the African historians who exposed me to these missing pages of world history. And those are his words, the missing pages of world history. Dr. John Henrik Clarke taught his whole entire life, virtually free of charge, to our community. He took being a historian seriously. He took being a griot seriously. And he loved our community fiercely. And not just Dr. John Henrik Clarke, but Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Asa Hilliard III, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. You know, there are so many others who have been screaming from the top of their lungs for African people to take ownership of our history and for African people to not continue to allow European people to poison our children with curricula that all but state you were a slave. You started as a slave. You became something great under European civilization. But when you were on your own in Africa, you did nothing. You were nothing. And be happy that Europeans actually came to Africa, gave you Christianity, and saved you. That is the current narrative. Now, I want to give some shout out to some white people who understand this narrative, who understands the strategy behind the propaganda of racism and white supremacy, who see it for what it is. One of these individuals is Jane Elliott. And those of you who've already gone through the curriculum, you may have seen her blue eye, brown eye experiment in our intro unit for class 3, the psychological effects of racism on both Blacks and whites. Well, I'm going to share with you a clip that I saw that she posted that was done last week, 6 days ago on the Roland Martin show. But I want you to hear a white woman pretty much saying the same things that I've been saying, Dr. John Henrik Clarke, and so many others have been saying for so long. And that is, we must teach the truth. That is the only way to destroy the theory of racism. We must teach the truth. And she elaborates on why white people are absolutely afraid to tell the truth. So I want to go right into that because I'm also going to show another presentation of a white scholar who has the courage in today's modern era and time to stand up and assert in front of a prestigious audience of Egyptologist, and I believe this is what was at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in collaboration with Harvard University. And again, just like I've been doing, just like so many African scholars have been doing, but providing evidence, incontrovertible proof that the people of the Nile Valley were Black African people in every aspect. Okay, so without further ado, here's Ms.
Someone about it. And by that, I mean going to therapy. Lately, the transition from college.
But if you want to get rid of. White people are scared to death right now, particularly white males. They're scared to death that they are going to lose their power in the future. And they are. But if you want to get ready for the future, if you want to be treated well in the future, treat others well in the present.
Call me Louis. This is my sport. Louis.
Victor Hugo said, "No force on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." The idea of one race, the human race, is an idea whose time has come. We are not going to be able to stop it no matter what they do. They can elect Trump after Trump after Trump, and that will not stop the idea that there's only one race on the face of the earth. It's the human race, and we are all members of it. You and I are cousins. Now, if you don't like being my cousin, that's too bad for you. But we are all in the same family. We are members of the family of man.
You say that all whites are racist. Can you expound on that?
Any white person who was born, raised, and schooled in the United States of America, if you aren't a racist, you're a miracle. Either that or you decided to educate yourself. Because education in this country is about white is right, brown's all right, black's got to stand back. Yellow's mellow, but whites, we educate in a way that says that white males have done all the adventures, have made all the adventures, have done all the discovering, have made all, and everything that is good and has been accomplished according to social studies, which is actually anti-social studies, by white males. It's a lie. But we do that in order to maintain the myth of white superiority. The myth of race has to be maintained at all costs in this country. Because if white people have to give up the color of their skin as being something that makes them perfect, what do they have left? If we start teaching the truth about history, if we start teaching about Nile Valley contributions to civilization, it will totally change the way we conduct ourselves in the classroom. It will have to. Columbus didn't discover America. You can't discover a place where people are already living, but we celebrate that every October. It's a lie. We need to get over, we need to stop telling the myths and start telling the truth.
Most people will say, I'm not racist.
I'm not a racist. Why, some of my best friends are Black.
Right.
Yeah, and then you say, name one. Or this one, I don't see color. And when some woman says to me, I don't see color, I say, I knew that if you saw color, you wouldn't dye your hair that way. Or I say, if you saw color, you wouldn't wear that shirt with those pants. I believe that you don't see color. It's an attempt to deny skin color. And it's an attempt to deny what's wrong with seeing the color of my skin. Is it all right for you to see me kind of pink? That's okay for me. I don't mind. And I suspect that you don't mind being seen the color you are. You have a right to be what you are. And until people in this country and people in this world get it into their heads that the first modern human beings that evolved on this earth were Black women. They evolved in sub-Saharan Africa about 280,000 years ago. And every human being on the face of the earth today has the memory of those Black women's genetic structure in their genes. Now, we don't want to admit that, but that's the way it is. And as people moved farther and farther from the equator, their bodies produced less and less melanin, so their hair, their skin, and their eyes got lighter. As they moved into the east, they ate a lot of fish and a lot of vegetables, so their skin took on a different tone. I found that out when I was raising little kids. My husband worked in a supermarket. He was the head of the produce department. And they had lots of oranges that they couldn't sell, so he'd bring them home. And I was feeding my kids orange juice like you never saw in your life. They began to have an orange cast to their skin. I thought they had a liver problem. So I took them to the doctor and she said, what are you feeding these kids? I said, well, lots of orange juice. She said, stop it if you want them to stop being orange. Now, if you think that skin color isn't anything other than the body's natural reaction to the natural environment, get over it.
If all white people are racist, according to you, can they be reprogrammed?
Of course they can. Of course they can. Of course they can be. It's called education. I'm an educator. The word educator comes from the root duc dus, which means lead, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in the act of leading people out of ignorance. Now, I know you can change them. The second year I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise in my classroom, it was filmed by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They gave me a copy of that film. I showed it to my father. My father was about 59 years old at the time. He's been a farmer all his life. He raised six kids, lost one, raised six. Watched that film as a 59-year-old man. When it was over, he stood up and with tears in his eyes, he took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his overalls, his bib overalls, and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." Nobody had dare say to me, "This doesn't work. This is too harsh. This isn't necessary. You can't teach an old dog new tricks because they're wrong." You can teach an old dog new tricks. You can teach people to give up the myth of racism. Somebody taught the Greeks to give up the myth that the sun was a god in a golden chariot that went across the sky every morning. They believed that for hundreds of years. We have believed the myth of 3 or 4 races, different races in this country, for long enough. There's no such thing as reverse racism. You can only be a racist if you have the power to institutionalize what you're doing to people who are different from you. What we're calling reverse racism is natural reaction to being treated unfairly on the basis of somebody else's ignorance. Now, don't ever let anybody say to you or about anyone around you that people don't like that person because of the color of their skin. That isn't the reason white people don't like people of color. They don't like people of color because they don't understand about skin color. And they don't understand that we all are descendants of somebody who looked like your mother. You don't really want to get me started on this because
I do want to get you started.
I'm really angry about how we are miseducating the American mind.
In your exercises, in order for them to see the light, or is there another way?
It's necessary to do what we do in offices and in the military and in schools and colleges and in hospitals and in community groups all the time. What we do is we become our parent ego. We go into our parent ego state, and that forces all those we're working with into their child ego state. And if you watch our so-called president, he spends most of his time either in his child or his parent ego state. He never gets into his adult ego state unless he's reading off the teleprompter. And he is such a poor reader that oftentimes he makes mistakes and then he is instantly in his child ego state right in front of your very eyes. It's absolutely fascinating to watch it happen. God created human beings, the human race, and they started out black women. White people created racism. Human beings created racism. It's time to get over it.
A lot of people have criticized former President Obama was not speaking out on race enough. Do you think he failed in that?
What if he had spoken out enough on race? Imagine what would have happened to him. The man is still alive. Do you remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Do you remember Malcolm X? Do you remember all those people have been killed not because of the color of their skin, but because of the fear of white people, that someone who isn't white is going to look better, sound better, act better, do better than they do. Mr. Obama was the president of all of us. He wasn't just the president of black people. He was the president of all of us. The man who's there now is and claims to be the president of the people who look like him. When he says, "Make America great again," what he's really saying is, "Make America hate again." You need to realize that it is not the intent of white people to let this situation change in favor of anyone but themselves. And right now, white people are really frightened. If you don't understand the destruction of Planned Parenthood offices, and you don't understand the wall that we're going to build on the southern border of the United States, you haven't read the book, The Birth Dearth by Ben Wattenberg. Ben Wattenberg was a brilliant Jewish man who was a member of the American Enterprise Institute. And he wrote a book, the first paragraph of which says, "The main problem confronting the United States today is there aren't enough white babies being born in this country." He was an advisor to presidents of the United States. He wrote the book in 1987. He says if we don't change this and change it rapidly, White people will lose their numerical majority in this country, and this will no longer be a white man's land. Now, I'm not misrepresenting this. I'm telling you exactly, almost exactly what he says. He says there are three things we can do to solve this. Number one, we could pay women to have babies, as they have been doing in Western European nations for years. Then he says, and these are his words, not mine, unfortunately, we would have to pay women of all colors to have babies, so we don't want to do that. He says the second thing we could do is increase the number of legal immigrants that are allowed into this country every year. And once again, he says, unfortunately, the vast majority of those wanting to come to this country today are people of color, so we don't want to do that. The third thing he says, and white women had better pay attention to this, 60% of the fetuses that are aborted every year are white. If we could keep that 60% alive, that would solve our birth dearth. Does that sound like racism to you? And if it doesn't, I want to know why it doesn't. If it doesn't, you don't understand what racism is. And I think it does. When we close Planned Parenthood clinics because we think they're there only for abortion, we need to take another look. They are used for many, many, many things, and many women need the things that they can get from Planned Parenthood clinics. But we are willing to do away with all that good to avoid allowing white women to have control of their own bodies. White people are scared to death right now, particularly white males. They're scared to death that they are going to lose their power in the future. And they are. But if you want to get ready for the future, if you want to be treated well in the future, treat others well in the present. What we do in the present constructs the future. What we have done in the past, we can learn from that. And we'd better learn from that. Those who forget the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. And when you read this book, you'll realize that that's exactly what we're doing. We're repeating the mistakes that we have made in the past because we aren't teaching about these mistakes in the present. We are not teaching history that is true. We aren't teaching social studies that is true. We aren't even teaching true geography, for God's sake. You want to talk about forgiveness? You want to talk about changing this thing? I cannot understand how Japanese people can stand the sight of any of us, and yet they do. I cannot understand why Black people who have been subjected to the ugliness that they've been subjected to in this country can get up every morning and go to work among us and not be absolutely furious. And I don't understand why we allow white people to behave the way they do. We have got to stop tolerating the intolerable. If it's intolerable for my Black cousins, and every Black person on this earth is one of my cousins, if it's intolerable for them, it's intolerable for me. I will not tolerate it. I will not tolerate it. That is not that. I am required not to tolerate that kind of treatment for the people who are related to me. And that's every person on the face of the earth. If your ignorance is such that you'll mistreat somebody because of your ignorance about the color of their skin, don't do it around me. Number one, I've been threatened with death lots of times. Now I say, go for it, fool. My husband died 4 years ago. Being with him would not be a bad thing for me. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Living a worthless, useless life is much worse than dying.
Wow.
From Dr. Umar Johnson recently.
I'm going to stop for a second because she said a lot in 10 minutes. A lot in 10 minutes. All human beings are part of the human race, the human species. That is true. All the things that she was saying about the fear of Europeans is absolutely true. Teaching the truth will end all notions of white superiority. That, she said, is absolutely true. The one part, though, that she misses is the fact that because of these environmental changes, the human personality shifted from something positive in relation to other human beings to something negative. So although we are from the same stock, we have developed different cultures, different ideologies, different worldviews. The worldviews that Europeans have developed are the most destructive worldviews that exist. They are anti-environment because the environment that the Europeans came out of was an unforgiving, frigid, cold environment. They had to struggle every single day to survive. If you guys have watched any of these shows alone, where they have competitions to see how long someone can stay out in the wild with just a few things that they're able to bring, watch one of those shows. And I want you to see how treacherous nature is when you are in a cold environment versus a warm environment. I want you to see how many animals are available in those environments versus a warm environment. I mean, all of these things, when you begin to have the conversation about it, it becomes common sense. But when you are not taught from a place of honesty, it's just going to be no common sense. There's no common sense for history to begin to be taught in American public schools with Western civilization, when Western civilization is the youngest civilization on the world tree. It makes no sense. Now, Jane Elliott essentially said that white people cannot teach the truth. If they taught the truth about Nile Valley contributions to world civilization, if they taught history from the genesis of human beings in Africa over 200,000 years ago, what everyone would discover is that it is Black African people. In fact, it is the African stock, it is the African genetics that enable modern human beings to not only spread throughout the entire world, but we are the only hominid species that remain on this planet. Out of all of the hominid species that emerged, you had Homo habilis, you had Homo erectus, you had Neanderthals, you had Denisovans, you had Heidelbergus or whatever. You had all of these different forms of hominids before you got human beings, us. And it was that stock in Africa, in the heart of Africa, that gave forth a new level of human ingenuity that enabled all human beings on this earth to be able to survive in every single climate that exists. That is how powerful that African stock is. We are the children from that tree. But we have been viciously told that that stock that we carry in our blood is actually inferior stock. Inferior stock. And that the youngest stock, the youngest genetics, is the most superior genetics. Everything flipped on its head, flipped on its head. The problem that we have right now today, when it comes to teaching the truth, is that Black people have been tricked out of the education industry by white people. What do I mean when I say tricked out of the education industry? Right now, only 7% of all public school teachers in the United States of America are Black. Only 2% of that 7% are Black men. In order to be a public school teacher, you have to have a master's degree. They've made the standards for teaching so high, even though the salary has never caught up with the higher standards that are required. So now, where you have Black women who used to go into the teaching industry all the time, now they're like, hold on, I gotta have a master's degree to teach elementary school and get paid $40,000, $50,000? I can go get a master's degree in something else and make $100,000 a year. So as they begin to require more and more education, more and more Black people started to see that that was no longer a lucrative career. It was no longer, it didn't make sense anymore. So here you have it, where our children are being taught by non-Black people. What are they being taught? Your child sits in classroom, and in English, what are they reading? Are they reading Black literature, or are they reading white literature? What is called the classics. They're reading the classics. When they go over to social studies, what are they learning? They're learning about the United States of America, about the founding fathers. All of that is positive. They're learning about all of the pioneers, all of the presidents, how brilliant they were, and all of these things. And inadvertently, they are learning that they weren't even considered a human being at this time. Now we're talking about a kid who may be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. So imagine learning about yourself and learning about other people around you and learning that the white people discovered everything. All of the founding fathers are white men. And the white men who founded this great nation didn't even think of you or your people even as human beings. You were 3/5 of a human. Imagine what begins to swirl in the head of that student. Positiveness or negativeness when it comes to how they think about themselves. When they go to discover more information about themselves, they are burdened with slavery over and over and over and over again. Everyone that they are introduced to as being a great Black person is a former slave. Was never ever in a position of being a world leader, running a country, or anything like that. You were a slave. This has to stop. But it is upon us to make this change happen. Because just like Jane Elliott said, why would a white person do that? They're invested in racism. They get paid off of racism. Racism is no more than affirmative action for white people. Racism says that just because of the color of my skin, I should receive privilege in this country. That's what racism says. How is that not affirmative action? But then we let them flip the script on us and tell us affirmative action is reverse racism. And then we have stupid Black Republicans who will go and spread that propaganda. Absolutely idiotic. Now, I read to you an introduction to the Nubian exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that was written by a guy named Timothy Kendall, in which he openly admitted at how racist the anthropologists who were paid by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and the Peabody Museum of Harvard to go to Nubia and do excavations there. And the fact that all of the things that they found were so exquisite, they could not at all attribute them to Black African people. Here today, we're at ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt is the last battleground. You have Egyptologists who are fervently trying to deny the Africanity of the ancient Egyptians. Because once again, this is the most famed civilization of all civilizations man has ever created, humanity has ever created. So if it comes to be known that this was a Black African civilization, the most fascinating, the most brilliant, the most spiritually in tune civilization ever known to humanity was a Black African civilization. What does that do to the philosophy, the theory of racism? If this gets out, If Black people begin to understand this to be the truth and begin a mass education in their own history, what would that produce? What would that produce? Because it cannot be challenged. You were able to hide it 100 years ago, when the only way for a person to get a book is to go to a library or a bookstore. And whatever they had in there, that's all that you had access to. Interlibrary loans and stuff like that. Now you have the internet. Now this information is all over the world at the same time. Not only is it in print, but you have people like me sharing it on video. So the gig is up. We see that the emperor has no clothes. It's time for us now to take it a step further so that we're no longer just teaching to the choir. Now, I'm going to share with you a video by a white Egyptologist of today who openly acknowledges the Africanity of ancient Nubia, who firmly understands that both Nubia and ancient Kemet were Black African civilizations, sister civilizations, but both were African. And they both had the same cultural worldview. In fact, they shared societies, they shared DNA. So how Egyptologists have tried for so long to make ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia separate and distinct civilizations so that they can make ancient Egypt not be a part of Black Africa. That has been strategic. There's absolutely no way they can deny Nubia as Black African. There's no way they can do it. But ancient Egypt, because of the fact that it was conquered by the Greeks, it was conquered by the Romans, it was conquered by the Assyrians, it was conquered by the Babylonians, because so many of those people came through and lightened the skin color of the population. And you're able to see and show Egyptians of fairer skin and all of those things. They've been able to promote those images as if these are the original people of Egypt, as if these were the original Africans who started the pharaonic dynasty of ancient Kemet. But it's important to know that there are white people who are openly trying to break down these barriers, because this is the only way that you're going to end racism. Absolutely the only way is to tell the truth. Tell the truth. Okay.
This, after all, is our annual Barbara Herman Lecture. But this year, it is not precisely a lecture, but a full symposium. It's entitled Ancient Nubia, New Ideas, New Discoveries. And I know you will not be disappointed. The order of our speakers approximately follows the order of the exhibition. So first, we'll have Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Institute for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Research at UC Santa Barbara. His talk is entitled Egyptological Bias, Intercultural Interactions and Entanglement. Next comes Dr.
Thanks very much, Sharita, and the organizers.
The surprising extent of the Meroitic heartland and its suburbs. The title of his lecture is Urbanity in Ancient Nubia. So without further ado, I'd like to have our first speaker come up and again, welcome you all.
We're not going to watch 2 hours of this, guys. We're just going to watch the first presentation, so don't be alarmed.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much, Sharita, and the organizers for pulling the symposium together. I hope you enjoy it. It's a great lineup. So Egyptologists have tended for a long time to view Nubia, and still to some extent today, I'm sorry to say, to view Nubia through the lens of Egypt rather than as a civilization on its own part. Nubia becomes kind of an appendage of Egypt. Anything good in Nubia is due to Egyptian direct influence. And even figures like this gentleman here, Pianki, one of the founding figures of the 25th dynasty, who secured control over all of Egypt and started off this vibrant civilization, we'll hear more from Catherine about, is often sort of thought of as just the result of Egyptian influence and even not that sophisticated. And I'll just give you one quote from John Wilson, a very sort of classic Egyptologist writing in the 1950s. He reflects this attitude of Nubian inferiority when describing the Kushite dynasty, and I quote, "The story of Pianki's conquest of Egypt is an extraordinarily interesting human development, particularly in the contrast between this backwater Puritan and the effete and sophisticated Egyptians." He goes on to say that, and I quote, "Thus Egypt fell under the nominal rule of an Ethiopian from the despised provinces and under the effectual rule of a woman," and he's talking about the god's wife of Amun, Amenirtis, based in Thebes. So managing to be both rather racist and sexist at the same time, which Egyptologists have a certain talent for. But in fact, what I'm proposing here is that we shift our viewpoint from Egypt looking kind of down at Nubia, and this is partly a projection of Egyptian ideology, partly a projection of modern notions of racism, also coming from a kind of colonial narrative of African inferiority. And instead, shift our viewpoint the other direction. And instead of looking at Nubia as produced by Egyptian influence, rather look at the dynamic nature of intercultural interaction, and particularly this idea of cultural entanglement that I'll explore further, using some examples from our recent research at the ancient Egyptian colonial site of Tombos, and also a Kerma site that I'll talk about first and go into right now. Now, while I'm talking about bad Egyptologists, I'll introduce George Andrew Reisner. If you've seen the exhibit, he was a brilliant archaeologist. And if any of you saw Elizabeth Miner's talk just recently, you'll know how his excavations can be mined for really interesting information about the dynamics of Kushite civilization. But his conclusions were, in fact, horribly racist. Again, he argues that the superior Egyptian bloodlines of an Egyptian colony at Kerma were diluted by intermarriage with the local Nubian women. So again, managing to be both racist and sexist at the same time. And he's taking his cue, of course, from ancient Egyptian ideology, which showed Nubians as inferior, as chaotic, as the classic enemy of Egypt. Egyptologists sometimes hold this up as, well, the Egyptians had a negative view of Egypt, so when of Nubia rather. So when Pianki came and took over Egypt, he must have been viewed as this kind of outsider, and that's very much John Wilson's argument. But in fact, this overlooks the kind of long history of interaction between the two civilizations and the fact that this is ideology, this is basically propaganda, but also the Middle Eastern peoples were treated in exactly the same way as Nubians, no less civilized, every bit as chaotic, every bit as the stereotypical enemy as were the other archetypical enemy, Libyans. That's kind of surrounded a sort of sea of chaos surrounding an inner Egyptian order. So for Reisner, taking this perspective, anything good in Nubia had to be the result of Egyptianization, another model that we see commonly used when looking at Nubia. And for him, that meant some kind of assimilation. And then once the Egyptian influence faded away, then you see Nubia goes into a decline until the next cycle of Egyptianization or Egyptian influence. So for him, he argued that Kerma must be an Egyptian colony. And I'm sorry to say this sometimes crops up in secondary sources still today because they're looking at older sources where this was really an entrenched idea up until the latter half of the 20th century when people started seriously pushing back against it. He also saw the New Kingdom Empire as a kind of civilizing influence, and again, that went into a decline to rise again with the Kushite pharaohs, who initially he argued were actually Libyans, not Nubians. I don't think anybody actually believed that though. But then later on argued for, again, another round of Egyptian influence. And these kind of tropes have been repeated over and over again. Now, without the extreme of calling Kerma an Egyptian colony, Egyptologists have still often thought of Kerma as somehow Egyptianizing. And this is a very strange notion, and we can see it from Reisner's perspective. He saw, you see a view of the cemetery at Kerma. I'm standing on top of the massive mortuary temple overlooking the last of the great royal tombs. And in that tomb, of course, you will have seen it if you've seen the exhibit, are statues from Egypt of the Lady Senue and her husband. And Reisner saw the statuary and assumed, oh, well, it must be an Egyptian colony. And that was partly because the Kerma civilization was so obviously complex and grand that it couldn't have been a native African civilization. It had to be, it had to have come from Egypt. And you'll note I use that terminology. That's not because I don't think that Egypt was not an African civilization. In fact, I'm firmly convinced it is, but it's often treated as if it isn't. And one still sees these sort of titles. So I think you have to look at Nubia and Egypt as two African civilizations in interaction. And so there were, to be fair, some Egyptologists who pointed out things like these massive tumuli, the practice of retainer sacrifice and so on, are all practices that are very different from Egypt. Also, all different aspects of the material culture, burial practice, I'll have some examples in just a second, are very different from ancient Egypt. So Reisner's idea that it was a colony, there was some pushback against it, but by and large, people had accepted it. But instead, what we should see is the display of items like the statuary actually looted from Egypt reflects a kind of projection of esoteric knowledge and power by these Kushite rulers. So you have this, this civilization to the north, and by bringing in and deploying these statues, other aspects of material culture, they're showing their knowledge of distant lands and power and authority by showing how they can control the other. And this, of course, is the same thing that motivated Egyptians to depict Nubians in the ways they did and so forth. Now, since the work of Charles Bonnet at Kerma, we know that Kerma was the center of a vibrant civilization, a true urban center, one of the earliest in Africa. And in fact, that Kerma was not just dominated by Egypt, but in fact was Egypt's rival in Northeast Africa. We can see a huge urban center and so on. Now, when we look at architecture like the great urban Defufa, which you see here, it represents this kind of idea of entanglement. So this can involve the adoption of different exotic practices or foreign practices, but more often the adaptation of those practices, imagery, and so on, material culture, but also indifference and rejection. And typically it's a blending of these different elements, and it's a process of mutual influence rather than simply assimilation driven from Egypt into Nubia, as again, Egyptologists have often argued. And you can see this at Kerma, the mud brick architectural technology of building a massive structure like this was clearly borrowed from Egypt, but the monument itself is a uniquely Nubian thing. In a similar way, within the urban center, we see round structures, and that round structure was originally made of a kind of post-hole traditional architecture in Nubia, but then later in mud brick. But we also see elements of rectilinear architecture and so on that would have been borrowed directly from Egypt. We also see things like ram imagery surrounding religion that may actually have influenced Egyptian ram imagery connected especially with the cult of the god Amun. So it does go both ways. Similarly, here's the massive mortuary temple that I showed you from standing on top, looking at the big tomb. And here we see Egyptian imagery like this winged uraeus deployed. And here's a good example of adaptation. So again, the technology, even the symbolism here is Egyptian, but in fact, it's integrated into a fundamentally Nubian institution and within a Nubian cultural framework. We also have examples of rejection. So all the beautiful Kerma pottery that you can see on display here. This is a beautiful bull that we found in a new excavation at a Kerma cemetery just to the south of our colonial site. Nubian ceramic traditions not only are not influenced by Egyptian ones, they deliberately, in spite of the fact they were in interaction with Egyptians, they knew about Egyptian pottery techniques like the wheel. All this pottery is handmade. They retained those traditions in spite of that contact. And even after the empire, as you'll see in a minute, they continued making these traditional style potteries with this kind of blacktop decoration. And we also see hybrids in, blended pottery with blended elements like this wonderful bowl here, which may be on display. Yeah, which is on display in the exhibit. And you can see here Aegean motifs, the kind of running knot motif, but also blended in with some Egyptian motifs, with some Levantine influences as well. So it shows that Nubian civilizations were not a kind of unsophisticated backwater, but in fact were very much engaged with the larger world of Northeast Africa as well as the Mediterranean. Now, in terms of the impacts of Egyptian influence during the Kerma era on the kind of local populations, we've begun excavation at a place called Abu Fatima, which is about 10 kilometers north of Kerma, so within the Kerma hinterland, but a relatively modest society, the people who were supporting the grand tradition. And here we see basically no real Egyptian influence. So we have flex burials. The pottery is almost all Nubian. There is one little Egyptian pot up in the upper left-hand side as an import. Could have been as much for the contents of the pot as the pot itself. But the Nubian pottery traditions definitely dominate. Features like ostrich feather fans, animal burials. We've had a couple of burials of dogs as well as sheep, and as a ceremonial component of burial. We see these things at Kerma as well. And again, the significance of sheep to Nubian civilization is something that perhaps represents that kind of two-way entanglement. Another thing that we see, again, an example of rejection is cloth. We have some cloth, but not a lot. Instead, the real emphasis is on leatherwork, and it's amazing stuff. So we're finding entirely preserved leather skirts on bodies. I mean, they're very delicate and kind of broken up, but we can reconstruct the whole thing, and you can see examples of this incredibly detailed stitching, and especially the piece in the upper right with its perforations, incredibly small, amazingly detailed, and there's a little hem in there too. And that's 5 centimeters, so the piece is like this big. It's incredible. And this little bit of woven, kind of woven strand, amazing. So we see Nubian crafts predominating at Kerma. The notion of a Kerma Egyptianization is really can't be sustained at all. But the influence we see tends to be very strongly adaptive and often rejecting Egyptian things. So rather than Egyptian material culture being, as Barry Kemp said, kind of overwhelming the sort of folksy Nubian culture with its fancy mass-produced objects and a kind of parallel to modern globalism, in fact, we see Nubian traditions are very durable. Now, the Kerma civilization lasted for around 1,000 years, but came to an end with the Egyptian conquest in about 1500 BC, which forged empires both in the Levant and throughout an extensive area in Nubia. And I'll mention a site called Askut very briefly, but my main examples will come from Tombos. And that cemetery of Abu Fatima that I just showed you is just right to the south of Tombos. Again, just a little bit north of Kerma. And the fact that Tombos was located at the third cataract of the Nile, kind of on a boundary where we see heavy Egyptian influence with these colonial communities founded throughout the region. But south of Kerma, we don't really, south of the third cataract rather, we don't really see a lot of evidence for full-on colonization. It seems that this was an important kind of internal boundary within the Egyptian empire. So again, an interesting locus to look at intercultural interaction in this process of entanglement. It also seems to have been a symbolic boundary. So we have a series of stelae. As I said, the fortress itself was established around 1450 BC, and we just recently established that it probably represents a place called Taroi that's mentioned in an Egyptian text from about the time of Amenhotep III around 1350 BC. So our main work though, and then what I'll focus on for examples here is within the cemetery. So the cemetery has two parts. One is a more kind of Egyptian part, if you will, with pyramid tombs and Egyptian style superstructures, but still a bit of entanglement going on. But then very interestingly, before the end of the New Kingdom, with what Egyptologists call the Ramesside period, starting around 1200 BC, we see a Nubian cemetery with Nubian style tumulus mounds on top of graves. Although again, with an increasing pace of entanglement and increasing sophistication of entanglement over time. Now, within the Egyptian part of the cemetery, we know, and I don't have time to really go into it here, but we know from isotopic analyses as well as craniofacial measurements that what we have is a population of Egyptian colonists who then intermarried with, or I can't really 100% say they were married, but interbred, to use not too fine a term, with the colonists, and we end up having a mixed population, and so we have both biological and cultural entanglements. The Egyptian colonists brought the full suite of Egyptian practices with them. So, for example, we have evidence for mummification, and not just ordinary mummification, but with a set of canopic jars that we recently found. This one dedicated to a priest named Hapi. Coincidentally, this particular jar is also dedicated to, or invokes the protection of the son of Horus, whose name is also Hapi, but a different Hapi. So a lot of happiness going on with this guy. But we actually, the sad shriveled remains of the person's internal organs were actually still in this. So we do know that they were practicing full evisceration. We have also found things like Ushabti figurines and heart scarabs. And the most freakish thing, I have to say, that we've ever found in Tumbos is this. It's a human skull, fragment of a human skull, with writing on it. And initially I thought, okay, this is weird. Something strange is going on here. And here you can see from infrared a little more detail. But I think what's happened is a papyrus is transferred, the ink from a papyrus is transferred onto the skull after the tomb was looted. And so this is probably a copy of the Book of the Dead, although I still haven't had a chance to verify that. Otherwise, we see typical Egyptian burial practice. You notice this is the bottom part of a woman, and her legs are pinned together, and that would indicate wrapping consistent with mummification. But most of the time, the flesh, wrappings, coffins even aren't very well preserved because wood is not very well preserved. This is a common problem in Nubia more generally. But here we found things like cosmetic equipment, very common. I love this little dish, which if you look at the left-hand side of it, you see there's a little beak and a little head, and it's got a little tail, so it's a little ducky dish. It's very cute. And earrings, other kinds of jewelry. That scarab, interestingly enough, actually dates from the Middle Kingdom. And it could have been looted from a tomb in the northern part of Nubia where there was a colonization episode, or even from Kush itself, where we find these Middle Kingdom scarabs. But I really think it's most likely an heirloom. So again, if these were colonists coming from Egypt, they were bringing treasured items with them that might eventually make their way into tombs. And the pottery is predominantly Egyptian. This is the cutest pot we found to continue our duck theme. A little incense burner dating from the Ramesside period, the later part of the cemetery, and was actually found at the bottom of a shaft of the tomb, right in the entrance. I love that kind of thing. You can imagine the people, in the funeral, and they're burning incense to help the deceased go through the afterlife. And other things, so we see a layout of a tomb here. So burial practice, head towards the west, facing towards the eastern horizon, to benefit from the rejuvenating powers of the sun, who's reborn every morning at dawn, and pottery, scarabs, amulets, other things. But you notice right in the middle of the shaft, there is a flex burial, so in the traditional Nubian style. And that's why we found about 10 flexed burials of all of women. So there's a gender dynamic to this sort of entanglement. This definitely represents an example of this kind of cultural entanglement. And here you see another one of these burials, a woman in a flex position that's very reminiscent of burials at Kerma itself. And she was found in association with the amulets. Actually, that's a single amulet, the two sides of it on the left, with the god Khepri, the ray born on the horizon, and then the god Nefertum below. And then another burial was found with these two wonderful little amulets of the god Bes. And Bes becomes an extremely popular deity in Nubia, taken up by the Nubians with great enthusiasm. We also see Nubian pottery showing up, again, in spite of the fact that Egyptologists have often posited that Nubian traditions disappeared under these layers of Egyptian colonialism and this idea of assimilation. In fact, we find Nubian pottery, a cooking pot on the left, a nice bowl, not quite as nice as the height of Nubian civilization, but nevertheless. And we also see Nubian cooking vessels at sites like Askut, and I don't have time to go into it. The fortress was built in the Middle Kingdom, still occupied in the New Kingdom. And you can see the brown or orangey brown lines are all Egyptian pottery. You can see most of the ceramic assemblage is heavily dominated by Egyptian pots, serving vessels like cups and jars. But the cooking vessels are dominated by Nubian cooking vessels. So we see a kind of Nubian takeover in the household related to cuisine. Now, just as the Kerma civilization came to an end, the Egyptian empire also came to an end with a rebellion of the last viceroy of Kush named Panhesi, who split the colony away and then ushered in what Egyptologists refer to as a dark age, but I think that's only because there aren't a lot of texts, which I guess is sort of the definition of an dark age. That doesn't mean that not anything was going on. And we have this inscription of Queen Katamala suggests some kind of successor state. And that's what, the newer archaeology looking at this transition are finding lots and lots of continuities, and not this notion of a kind of return to barbarism that eventually ushered in individuals. This is the Nubian pharaoh Taharqa. Through a second wave of Egyptianization, we don't really need to posit that Egyptian influence, but rather we can see this as, at least in part, due to these continuing cultural entanglements. So here's Reisner again, and of course he argued that in fact these Nubian dynasts were had sort of returned to barbarism, and then were actually Libyan kings to start with, and so on. But this idea of the Nubian colonies sort of splintered apart into these small chiefdoms, is usually the term used, which again is kind of cued to colonial era language about Africa. After an Egyptian withdrawal, in fact, there was no Egyptian withdrawal. The colony split away, and we see this in places like Amara West, Tombos, and various other sites. We see continuity across that divide. And and what we see following this is a lot of entanglement and adaptation, and I won't go into this. Catherine's going to be talking more about the royal side of things, but this is how a Kushite king represented himself, as opposed to the sort of illustrations even from National Geographic that show Nubians, let me just go back one second, that show Nubians very much in the trope of the enemy that opposes Egypt from the New Kingdom rather than on their own terms that you see here. So at Tombos, so I'd like to just look at how this plays out at a more secondary level with a broader population at Tombos. So we see the continuing construction of pyramids. This pyramid here overbuilds the ruin of New Kingdom tombs. So I think it may date to the Third Intermediate period, which would be very exciting. But we're going back this season, and then hopefully we'll be able to pin down the date a little bit better. But it's definitely very, very late, maybe 25th dynasty, like this pyramid here. And it's important to remember that monumental forms and symbolism like pyramids, at some point during their life in Nubia, and there were dozens and dozens of pyramids built in Nubia before the 25th dynasty, they become internalized. They become not an Egyptian thing, but really a Nubian kind of monument. And so instead of looking to Egyptian pyramids as the inspiration for Nubian pyramids, I think you need to look at these local monuments, the monuments of the Egyptian and eventually entangled. Many of these people were of Nubian ancestry who were important bureaucrats within the colonial apparatus. And the point that there's no reason to think that this colonial apparatus simply disappeared. And in Tombos, we have a lot of hints of practices that we see later on in the 25th dynasty that represent these kind of complex adaptations and entanglements. So we have this amazing horse burial, beautifully done, kind of echoing the horse burials or presaging the horse burials at El Kuru. with a bit of iron, with very early piece of iron from about 900 BC. And then even a little bit of jewelry that makes you think of the elaborate tap that we find in the burials at Kuru. And the pace of entanglement just increases. So amongst the tumuli, we see Nubian practices like the tubular structures themselves, bed burials, and blacktop pottery. But still Egyptian amulets and scarabs and things. The scarab is quite interesting because it looks as if it doesn't have any good parallels. So it looks as if it might have been a local product. Yeah. Oops. It's not going to do that, is it? No, it's not. Okay, so I'll just go through these slides very quickly because I'm running out of time. I apologize. So one of these burials, again, burials show this combination of things. So we have a mummified burial in the remains of a coffin on top of a bed, but with blacktop pottery. So we see these complex sets of entanglements. But again, unlike that notion that the Nubians were a sort of a backwater empire, we see iron weaponry, but juxtaposed with lithic tip weaponry. And we see these from the royal tombs, as well as other places. Imagery like this bowl with cattle on it that's very reminiscent of the bowl from right here. It fits into what's been referred to as the international style of the Iron Age. So you can see these kind of bull imagery and an elaborately decorated wooden box with images, and I'll help you out here, of a cow licking a calf. In front of that, a binu bird, a stork. So in this kind of a swampy motif, it's kind of a papyrus swamp. Here's an ivory from Nimrud that shows you exactly the same motif. So it's about rebirth and with a heavy sort of overlay of cow symbolism. Another example of the god Nefertum, again, both the cows on either side, quite unique, but also tying into the international style. So here from Assyria, from exactly the same time frame, images of Nefertum, but in this case flanked by deities. And then finally, inside of the box, we found this amazing set of vessels. This one made of faience. This one is absolutely unique, and I think must be a local product because it doesn't really find any close parallels. But this one is a sort of pièce de résistance, this beautiful little Bes vessel. Again, that god Bes being very influential, and this little frog lid, quite remarkable. And again, we see this is tapping into a kind of international style, both in the Levant with these examples, including in monumental form. But it's all Bes was and other dwarf deities like Patekos were something that tied Nubia itself together. Oops, I'll go back just very briefly. There we go. So we can see these kind of amulets spread around in both royal and non-royal contexts up and down Nubia. And there's that little beautiful Patekos that was found, very much like the ones from the Royal Cemetery. And just to finish, so Nubia, far from being a backwater, was actually a full participant, and I think actually generating objects in this style new to themselves, a fully cosmopolitan civilization representing these different kinds of cultural entanglement, but coming up with new objects, new material culture, new theologies, playing off of Egyptian ideas. So the frog amulet, this little frog lid, there's actually a parallel all the way across the Mediterranean and Sardinia. The bowls with cattle imagery surround the Mediterranean, found quite widespread. Another little object I didn't talk about, but a little scarab with a cryptographic inscription that was common throughout the Mediterranean world, but in fact is a very innovative variant and very sophisticated variant on this. So Nubians brought a new level of sophistication to their intertwining and adaptation of Egyptian material culture coming out of the colonial encounter, but also the long history of interaction. And then here, a few acknowledgements for all our supporters and my co.
All right. So here you have an anthropologist talking about how racist the field of anthropology, the Egyptologists were, who discovered all of these artifacts from the Nile Valley, from those in Egypt as well as in Nubia. But yet there are no Black or African historians present. How can you talk about ending racism in the academy, when you can't even understand that in order to have any legitimacy, why aren't there any African people there, any African anthropologists there, any African anthropologist? There's no one other than Anthony Browder, who has been given permission to do an exhibition, excavate a burial, a tomb in Africa. One African American. And they still today can't understand how what they're doing in terms of how they are talking about an African civilization, who they are allowing to even go and do anthropology. We don't even have the ability to go and do research on African history that you acknowledge is Black African. When George Reisner and company went to the Sudan to do their excavation in Nubia, they negotiated that that their contingent would get 50% of everything they discovered, and the government of Sudan would get the other 50%, and they got to choose the first 50%. How do you get to negotiate burial items from African people to give to colonizers? How can you not understand that you don't have any legitimacy, you don't have any authority to circumvent the original people to go to their ancient lands, excavate ancient burials, and literally take whatever you discover? So even as you hear, quote unquote, liberal white men like this gentleman here, who can openly acknowledge that his predecessors was racist, but can't see how they themselves are still carrying the same racist attitudes about history that they are trying to hold others in contempt for. How is it you're acknowledging that these were Black Africans, Black African people on the continent of Africa, African civilizations, but yet you don't refer to any African people to be a part of the process? This is why we need to return to power. We can't even protect our dead, let alone those of us who are alive. We can't even protect our dead ancestors' tombs from being eviscerated. The government of Egypt, the government of Sudan, they're making hundreds of millions, if not billions, off of the history of Black African people, off of the history of the ancient people of Kemet who were Black African, off of the history of the ancient Nubians who were Black African. And what is their response to the narrative, the racist narratives about Egyptology? They hold hands with the Europeans, and in unison, they have been trying to maintain that ancient Egypt was not a Black African civilization, but yet they want our money. Yet they want African Americans to come over to Egypt, spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in tourism, but yet the next breath will deny that these people were Black African. The only way, people, that we are going to rid ourselves of this mental enslavement is for us to begin to know the truth about world history, to know the truth about European history. Everything that you saw in that presentation was before Europeans, the earliest of the Europeans, came out of their dark ages. Remember, that period is 900 BC. 900 BC. 900 BC. And here you see African people already in high civilization, already making all types of decorative pottery, jewelry, wearing exquisite makeup, exquisite weaving, clothing, all of these things. And I shared this with you because I wanted you to see Nubia in and of itself, without, like he said, being an appendage to ancient Egypt. The city of Kerma, which is founded around 2500 BC, was one of the earliest and first urban centers on the continent of Africa. But yet, very few African people know of Kerma. You know all of ancient Egypt, but you don't know of Kerma. So once again, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we as a people know our history, catalog our history, and have a curriculum, a way for us to teach every successive generation our true history. That is the only way to retain our culture. But if you don't teach the true history, the culture that is being taught is European culture. The worldview that is being taught is the European worldview. And right now, what we're seeing is that there's too many African people who have a European worldview. And it has been at the expense of the culture of African Americans. Our culture is dying. More and more people of our culture have become Europeanized than ever before. Than ever before. If too many people of our culture become Europeanized, and we already are being taught in a European curriculum, who is going to be there to ensure that African history, that these missing pages of world history don't go forgotten? Who is there? Who is there? I shared with you all of the protests that I've been reading about against all of this propaganda. And this is a part of our curriculum, class 4 of the intro unit. And what shocked me was that all of the protest movements were white educators, literally white students walking out. No Black educators, no Black students protesting and demanding a change in the curriculum whatsoever. It's almost as if we laid down and accepted that this is just how it's going to be. But we here at the Black Achievement Fund are saying emphatically, no, 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 no. We're here with the Education for Life Academy teaching our own. We're here providing the evidence so that when you do begin to study this and learn this and share this, no one can come and refute you because you can stand on facts. You have evidence at your fingertips. But without that evidence, how much confidence can a little Black girl or a little Black boy have in confronting adults, teachers, who may not even have this information, but have a whole catalog of information that supports white supremacy and the narrative that Europeans created modern civilization as we know it? They got a ton of stuff that they can pull from. What does that little Black girl, that little Black boy, what evidence does she or he have to present when they're being told what you're talking about is absolutely crazy? Your people ain't contributed none of that stuff. So the idea is to have facts to back up what is being said. And it is not enough for people like me to be able to state this. You have to have corroborating facts, unfortunately, from other white people who are tired of having racism be tied to them. There are a lot of white people who want to be freed from the burden of racism. But like the Black Vanguard, like the Dr. John Henry Clarks, usually they don't get any attention. They are ignored, they are silenced, their books aren't published, they don't get tenure at major universities, they don't get to teach the courses that discuss these things. So you only get to hear them in a symposium like this. If they know all of this information and they know that it needs to be taught, why aren't they demanding that this information now is taught in public schools? They are very comfortable in an audience of all white people. No Black historians, no Black anthropologists in the room. They're totally comfortable of having a conversation amongst themselves about how racist they have been and talking about world history as they're being racist in the moment by not having any African people who have been on the front edges of maintaining the Africanity of these civilizations for decades. They didn't mention any of these African people who've been saying forever before George Reisner even went to Nubia that these were Black African civilizations. African people, we do not have the power to even tell our own story. And even when quote unquote liberal white people openly acknowledge their racism, they're not doing it to Black people. They're not going and tell Black people, hey, listen, Black people, we're sorry, we were very, very racist. These civilizations are Black African civilizations. We owe so much to Black people. We're terrible. They're not saying that to a Black audience. Wouldn't a Black audience receive that material, that information much more enthusiastically, much more powerfully? Wouldn't it benefit African people who have been told the opposite for so long? Wouldn't that have been grand to openly invite Black people into this conversation? Can't do that. Can't do that. But instead, they get to make themselves feel like the anti-racist by sharing the fact that they've been so racist against African people in a room of only white people. Publish it in scholarly journals and in places that are inaccessible to Black people. Do not demand that the places in which they're having these symposiums in implement this new knowledge in any meaningful way in curriculum. Where is it? Where is it? I need you guys to understand this. Even as we have well-meaning white people, like the Jane Elliots, like I can't think of the guy's name who we just watched, they still have blinders on. They still have blinders on. The most liberal that I see, most still operate within a racist framework, and they can't even see it. They're oblivious to it. Do you think they went to African American Studies Department of Boston University, of Harvard University, of Tufts University, of any of the universities in the area, and advertised and promoted this lecture? Do you think Black people would have not shown up? After all, this is their history. So how you don't even invite the people whose histories that you're talking about in the room when you're talking about them? Because it looks awfully uncomfortable to stare at an audience of Black African people and to speak with authority on their history when you didn't allow any of them access to the excavation. You didn't ask them to participate in it. You didn't ask them to come with you to Nubia. So they're still operating with a very narcissistic sense of entitlement. How much money do you think these exhibitions cost? Here, African historians had to come up with this same information, this same knowledge, without a dime in research dollars, without a dime. On their own dime, they got to go to Africa and do their research on their own dime. This is the state of affairs where we are. Even the friends that we have don't even know how to be good friends, because the amount of racism that we have all been subjected to is so deep and visceral that the average person can't even recognize it. Black nor white, Black nor white. We as African people, we as the vanguard, we got to step up. We got to step up. We have to step up and own our history. We have to step up and demand these schools to incorporate this information that is now incontrovertible. Why aren't we doing that? But yet, what do the Republicans do? What do the conservatives do? They beat you to the punch. So before you even get to argue your position, they're arguing against it with what do they call it? Critical race theory. So here they're on the offensive. You have the racists who are on the offensive on the education front here in America. You have the racists who are consistently attacking what is being taught and getting their way. Where is the liberal voice in the curriculum? Where truly are these facts that all of these white historians, all of these well-meaning, good white people, where are they showing up in popular culture and curricula? Where? And this is why it's so important for us to move beyond talking to the choir. Here you have white people in a closed room talking about how racist their predecessors were and how anti-racist they are, because they're openly acknowledging the Africanity of ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet. And while they're doing it, they're granting white anthropologists, white Egyptologists, millions of dollars to go and excavate African lands, ancient African ancestral burials, and take whatever they find. And cannot see how that squarely puts them in the same category as the racist predecessors who they are holding in contempt. And we're supposed to be thankful for them. We got a long way to go, but I'm so thankful that we are in the information age. I'm so thankful that in this moment, we get to share all over the world to anyone who ears are open, who eyes are open, to finally be able to learn the truth about the world, the truth about the imposters who are claiming to be the world's saviors. It's absolutely ridiculous. So continue to follow us, this lecture series. Once again, I want to give a shout out to Dr. John Henry Clarke and all of our ancestors who have kept this alive. We're doing this in honor of them. Okay, so continue to share these lecture series. This is our 8th class. All of the previous lectures are on the Black Achievement Fund's YouTube page. Simply go to Black Achievement Fund. Simply go to YouTube and type in Black Achievement Fund, and you'll begin to see the Missing Pages of World History lecture series. If you have not joined the Black Achievement Fund, what are you waiting on? We're $9, tax deductible, okay? 10 million Black people and our allies, $9 a month equals 90 million a month and over $1 billion a year. And before I go, since I said, and our allies, I know it may seem a lot of times like I'm being heavily critical of all European people. I want to let you guys understand that what I'm doing here is teaching history. And unfortunately, the history of Europeans as a people, it's not a good history. It's not a good history. Unfortunately, the actions of the multitude of Europeans are cast upon all Europeans. That's just the way that it is. But my job is to first and foremost help unshackle the minds of African people, of my people. My responsibility is to my people first. And to all of our allies, if you don't have the understanding to know that what has been done to Black people needs to be undone, and that at times certain language needs to be said as part of that healing. If you can't understand that, then you can't claim that you're an ally. You cannot claim that you understand and feel for African people because of all of the wicked things that your people have done, and then chastise language. Like Jane Elliott said, she's a white woman. She said, I can't understand all the stuff we have done to Black people, and they can go up and go to work next to us and be nice to us, still invite you to their homes and bring food and all. What in the world? This is because we have a different worldview. We have a different personality developed in which our fellow human being was someone to cooperate with, someone to love as a brother or sister. We were all an extended kinship. But what do we have now? We have African people who look Black, but when you examine their actions, their behaviors, they're all European. They're all European because we in our head have internalized European glory. And please don't say you haven't if I do an assessment and every single thing that you do is European. If you saved up your money to go to Europe before you went to Africa, I show you African print, you look like that's the ugliest stuff on earth. And then come and show up in some ridiculous looking European ensemble. I plead with you guys through these lecture series to make sure that you educate your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews. Give them empowerment. Instead of giving them some Jordans, instead of buying them some clothes, give them empowerment, give them self-esteem. Be a hero to someone. Teaching someone about who they are, sharing with them the evidence as to their true history, you become a hero. For all of you out there looking for meaning, there's a task right there. Educate somebody. I'm gonna end, right at 9:30. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this lecture series. If there are any questions or comments about what was shared today, here is the opportunity to share. So if any of our ambassadors. Okay, thank you all once again for your time this evening. I enjoyed you as always. Please share. And if you haven't joined the Black Achievement Fund, join us, www.baf.solutions. All right, very simple, very easy. The time is now. Peace. BAF Hub.
Peace.
All right.
Thank you for your time.